Our last speaker for the afternoon is Dr. Bill Allison. And Dr. Allison is my academic godfather, by which I mean at every stage of my career, he has been there saving me from making catastrophic mistakes. That means he was actually the first peer reviewer of my first book. He's written letters of recommendation to secure me promotions. He's set me up with speaking opportunities. Every time I turn around, Bill's doing something wonderful for me. Someday, I'll think about paying him back. Today is not that day. Bill is currently a professor of history at Georgia Southern University. He served as the chair of the department there. He's been a visiting professor at the Air War College as well as the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. And most recently, he was the General Harold K. Johnson Visiting Chair in Military History at the U.S. Army War College, which leads me to believe that he doesn't really like his day job and he keeps taking these other positions on a temporary basis. Bill has written thousands of pieces by this point, but some of the great highlights: he's the author of The Gulf War. He's the author of My Lai, An American Atrocity in the Vietnam War. He's the author of Military Justice in Vietnam, The Rule of Law in an American War. And he's a series editor, so he's brought out dozens of books on behalf of other authors, including myself. He's presented papers around the world in multiple languages. He knows all the local customs. He's impossible to find when he decides to disappear. He's currently writing a book for the University Press of Kansas that's looking at 1968 and the effects of the Vietnam War, both domestically and internationally. And he's also working on a book for Oxford University Press on the Tet Offensive. Please give a warm welcome to my good friend and academic godfather, Dr. Bill Allison.
Oh, boy. This has been a really interesting day, and I know that at this point that I am what stands between you and, according to the schedule, a reception, and then food, and then German beer for some of you, and Moscow mules for the rest of us back at the hotel bar. But it's been interesting to me today, to just listen to these presentations and especially your questions and everything. So we'll see how this goes. Before I begin, first of all, again, thanks to everyone who organized this thing, FPRI and the museum. It's been, just first-class deal, and so thanks so much for all your efforts, and thanks to all of you for being here. These are the sort of events that I rarely second-guess what I do for a living, except when I'm at a retreat or something like that, and I want to run away and disappear like Paul suggested. But otherwise, I love what I get to do. We're so lucky that we get. What profession do we get to do things like this, right? I mean, it's just pretty extraordinary, and we don't want to promote these events too much lest other people find out, right? And also, as we're sitting here today, sitting in the back, I want to just, Corey, Bethany, they've been standing here all freaking day, right? Filming this and everything. So please, well done. Well done. You deserve a shout out, right? Okay, so I got tasked with World War II, something I really don't know anything about, because I haven't written a book on World War II, but Paul, we might do that at some point. This is a great topic, in essence, because it's easy. Basically, what happened was on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked a naval base and other military installations. We had a place called Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Kind of like the Philippines at the time. I think a lot of people didn't know where that was, but it was American. And we got pretty cheesed, and we declared war a couple days later, and there you are. Thank you very much. Your questions? No? All right. I tried. When I was starting to put this together, it was easy to let me back up. What has impressed me with the talks today so far is a good mix of the events and also kind of the big ideas. And Corey got us off to a great start earlier today with, talking about Thucydides and Clausewitz and that sort of thing. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. And what I originally started to do is put together a thing and let's talk about, Lend-Lease and destroyers for bases and stuff, right? Events. It's World War II. You got it, right? You know what went down. These other wars, a little less familiar, right? And they were very useful to kind of get us up to speed on. But World War II, I think we kind of got it. So a few days ago, I literally ripped it up. I mean, I had my talk all ready to go, and I literally I hit delete. Right? I destroyed permanently. And started all over, because what started to kind of really kind of claw at me a little bit was talking about values, national values. There's realpolitik reasons why we go to war. There are philosophical things that cause us to do this. And every nation state, every people has a core set of beliefs that are shared and broadly accepted. They may not apply equally to everyone and that sort of thing. Yeah, sure. But you have a sense of who you are based upon some fundamental principles and stuff. And what I want to do is kind of, how did these evolve? What are these things? Where do they come from? How do they manifest themselves? And how do they play in, as you get to the year 1941 and give us philosophical reasons, principled reasons, in addition to all the other things of going to war. So that's the idea. We'll see how this goes. Now, these values, they're core beliefs. They can be political, they can be cultural, economic, things like that. But they should serve as a constructive path that leads a nation in a direction that generally should be positive, that should have purpose, that should provide prosperity for its citizens, for the nation state, that sort of thing. And therefore security. That's the idea. But they can also be equally destructive, catastrophic, even destroy the nation state itself when they're misguided, misplaced, that sort of thing. And World War II is a good example of this. But let's look at just some general ideas here, and then we'll get into the U.S. part. But I want to kind of go back to where we started this morning with Clausewitz and Thucydides and stuff like that, because they're fun, they're interesting, and we don't get to talk about them enough. I think they help us understand, shape some of these things. First of all, grand strategy. That term, that idea. Hal Brands, our friend and colleague who's going to be talking tomorrow about the Gulf War, had a really cool book a few years ago on the idea of grand strategy and if it's useful or not. We have a pretty good definition for it. It's the purposeful and coherent set of ideas that it's about what, let me start over. A purposeful and coherent set of ideas about what a nation seeks to accomplish in the world and how it should go about doing it. Okay? A purposeful and coherent set of ideas about what a nation seeks to accomplish in the world and how it should go about doing it. Grand strategy connects means to ends. It involves resources, how you use those resources, to what purpose do you use those resources. It sounds pretty easy, but it's not at all, not even remotely easy. And what should be that purpose? Well, in war, if you go back to right after World War I, in the decades after, Littlehart, writing, when he talked about war, he said things like, you got to remember that in war, victory is not an end in and of itself. Okay? You should be trying to achieve a better peace than what you had before the war. Otherwise, what's the point? Why would otherwise it be worth the sacrifice and cost? to the nation and its citizens. So let's keep that in mind as well. Clausewitz. It's like you should have the duck that drops from the ceiling every time you mention Clausewitz or Thucydides or something, right? Ding, ding, ding. Yeah, or play bingo. Clausewitz said, right? Clausewitz said. How many times have we said that? Clausewitz said. Clausewitz said, everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult, giving evidence to how hard this is. War is fraught with peril, with pitfalls, unknowns, in large part because it's human. It's because we do it. We are imperfect, we're flawed, and as Corey mentioned earlier this morning, sometimes we're just flat out freaking stupid. Right? Yeah. There are so many seen and unforeseen limitations about what people can do, what they're capable of. So even the best intentioned, best planned, most just policy can go very wrong, can have tremendous unintended consequences, and even place the nation state at greater risk than before you embarked on this war, resulting in a peace that's not better than before. Most important, I think, is that what the nation is pursuing, what the objective is, and how it's pursuing it. Is this acceptable to the people the nation tasks with undertaking this? Is it acceptable to them? They're the ones who are fighting and dying. So there must be some sort of acceptance that this is okay to do. If it's not morally or culturally or whatever acceptable, not in line with the values of the nation, then the people will be unwilling to take this on. They won't be willing participants. Add to this, when you're deciding to do these things, you're making assumptions. You got to have good self-awareness, typical stuff like that. Good risk assessment, doing the usual suitable, acceptable feasibility test, that sort of thing. But when you do that, you got to understand the values, the interests, and the like assumptions of who you're fighting. You have to know them as well, because if you misunderstand them and what's important to them, at base what their values are, you can also get into a lot of trouble. So values are the foundational variable in making these determinations. In war, they help link the people, the government, and the military. Yes, we did it again. There's Clausewitz. Remember your Trinity, which sometimes we call the remarkable Trinity, right? Okay? Just to refresh your memory. Some of you are looking a little hazy. Linked are primordial violence, hatred, and enmity, which we often associate with the people. Then chance probability, within which the creative spirit is free to roam. Right? I don't speak German, so I don't know how it sounds in German. I'm sure it's much more harsh than that. But you often associate that with the commander and the army, that sort of thing. And then the element of subordination as an instrument of policy, which makes war subordinate to reason alone. A lot of times Clausewitz will also refer to this as politics. Okay? And we associate this with government. So in short, will, chance, and reason, people, military, government. They kind of superimpose on the other, that sort of thing. Clausewitz is not easy. That's why there's a lot of debate about him and what he really meant, what's lost in translation, that sort of thing. Political leaders have to manage or control the primordial violence, right, and the hatred of the people, so that the people will willingly fight and die for the nation. Values shape this primordial energy. This is why we call it will. Government harnesses national values to control and maintain the will of the people, or the ability, or the eagerness, the emotion of the people to carry this activity out. Values, in turn, give the commander and his army the confidence or the belief that what they're doing, this state-sanctioned violence that they're undertaking, is just. And for the people themselves, values are a touchstone, a framework for their participation in this war. All right, so we've opened the lid of Clausewitz. I promised you some Thucydides. right? You began the day with it, you're going to end the day with it. Thucydides' history, it's amazing. I mean, it's just incredible that we still read this, we still go back to it. It's still so prescient. It's timeless in so many ways. And I think that for me personally, when I read it, and when I've taught classes at the war colleges and whatnot about theory of war and strategy, we spend a lot of time looking at Thucydides and really just how hard this is, how difficult war is, how many limitations there are on states and the people and what they can do. And you look at Athens and Sparta, two completely disparate city-states with distinct values and interests, each convinced of their own perceptions of themselves, as well as the assumptions of the other. They're each convinced of their own exceptionalism. Remember that word, exceptionalism. But they're each convinced that they're both special, kind of like every single one of your students. And mine too. I always make A's. Not anymore, you don't. It's interesting that while Athens had a democracy, such as it was, it had little use for justice in its kind of tyrannical approach to how it dealt with everybody else in the neighborhood, right? Sparta, who's militaristic, ultra-nationalist, all that stuff, placing the needs of the group above the individual. The individual in Spartan society really doesn't exist except as a tool of the state. Actually does value justice, which leads several city-states to ally themselves with Sparta against Athens, right? So those values actually matter there. Thucydides has his own trinity. Of course he does. Fear, honor, and interest, which has been mentioned a few times today. These are basic and instinctive impulses that drive politics: fear, honor, and interest. You got to understand your own fear, your own honor, your own interest, and you've got to understand the other guy's fear, honor, and interest. Athens didn't get it. Sparta won the war, a war that it started out of what? Fear of Athenian power. Right? Okay. Athens forgot about honor often. It allowed its unbridled interest, the expansion of its empire, to lead it astray, to get into unwise campaigns. We mentioned Sicily earlier in the day. The ill treatment of allies, and of course its ultimate destruction. Rest assured, neither are clean, Sparta or Athens. I mean, they all do bad things. They all pump up their own values. They betray those values. They commit atrocities. They betray allies, things like that. They often risk and sacrifice their moral standing, for sure. That doesn't happen anymore, right? No. We would never do that. But Thucydides reminds us that war is a dirty, awful undertaking. It's an unclean business. So fear, honor, and interest, a trinity shaped by the values that a people hold, is fundamental to their existence for good or ill, no matter how unfair or just. Okay? So with that in mind, let's look at America. What shapes our values? Where do these things come from? We can find them in a lot of places. They have a long history, much older than this nation. They appear in documents, in speeches, in policies, that sort of thing. You can find them in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. You can find them in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. You can find them in Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. You can find them in the Monroe Doctrine. You can find them in Wilson's 14 Points. You can find them in the Atlantic Charter. You can find them in Corey mentioned Teddy Roosevelt's first the inaugural address, the State of the Union address. You can find them in a lot of places. You can even find them today in the current national security policy of the United States. It begins with, this is what our values are, and this is how they shape our interest and, in turn, our strategy. Okay? So what are these things? We could all make up our own list. If I asked you all to do write down five American values, I bet that probably at least one or two of those things we'd probably all have. So I'm going to give you my list. If you want to go down with me after in the questionnaire, let's go. All right? Bring it on. I'm not going to follow my sword for these. But these are general ideas. Self-governance, individual liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that Lockean concept about the opportunity to acquire property, or later it means probably more in the modern period, to be able to prosper economically. toleration, due process, self-determination, divine purpose, overall, exceptionalism. There's that word again. The boundaries of these are fuzzy. Some are philosophical, some are political, some are economic, they're cultural, they're different things, but they cross over a good bit. You can trace their origins back as far as you like. You can trace them back to Thucydides in some cases, but we're not going to do that. They're largely a consolidation of stuff from the Enlightenment, right? So your Descartes, your Locke, your Voltaire, your Montesquieu, all those dudes, right, who look at things like at natural law, that sort of thing. So for us, for the American experience, these ideas, how they grow out of this Enlightenment period, things like, kind of just basic principles, reason rather than the divine, right? Rationalism over priestly fiat. Democracy of free men. Democracy of free men. What does that mean? Well, it means if your name is Whitey McWhidington and you're a property owner. That's what it means. Okay? That's what they meant at the time. All right? White men who owned property. Those are free men. So the democracy of free men rather than that very dodgy game of hereditary chance, right? I tell my students, look, the reason this dude is king is because he won the great sperm crapshoot. Right? That's the reason he's there and who he is. Talk about chance. Okay? Individual liberty rather than arbitrary group conformity. Separation of powers rather than absolute rule. Social contracts that frame the relationship and responsibilities of both government and governed. Just came to me. We're all Monty Python, right? Okay, good. I'm among civilized people. Good. Remember the Holy Grail, right? Where they're out working in the field and King Arthur shows up. I'm your king. King. I didn't vote for you, right? And what does he say? It's like, was it watery tarts lying around in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government, right? Yeah. There's more to that, right? Like something about executive power or derives from the mandate of the masses, right? Right, okay. You learn a lot from Monty Python. But these things and others, they influence our founding, right? And this is where, Jefferson pulls a lot of these things together from these various Enlightenment ideas, from the English Declaration of Rights back in 1689. He probably copied a little bit of George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, but we're not going to say that too loudly. But he puts these together in this Declaration of Independence. Here's where these values really start to take shape. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, white men who own property, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, those same white men who own property. Right? Okay. But these thoughts aren't original to Jefferson, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that they were familiar to those people at that time. So when the white property owner reads the Declaration of Independence in colonial America or in England, he reads it, he understands it. I'm familiar with this. This makes sense to me. It's not a shock to them or anything like that. It's not wholly revolutionary at all. But these values form the basis of why we fight this war for independence in 1775. If Frank Capra was there in 1776, right, he reads this, he's going to make a movie on why we fight, and it's going to be that. Okay? But he's not there. We don't have film, so we don't do that. These appear in subsequent solidification, the subsequent solidification of the Union of States, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. There's checks and balances to prevent tyranny, protect individual liberty. There's due process. There's protections for individual freedoms, right, like the right to assemble, freedom of speech, religion, press, that sort of thing, as well as unenumerated rights, implied rights that are, I believe, if I remember right, in the Ninth Amendment. It rejects hereditary rule for a rational government by consent of the government, linking both government and citizenship in a free society. That's where all this really gets going. Now, those things sound great, but they're easily manipulated. Dr. McDougall just gave us a great talk, an example about how this stuff was twisted around for manifest destiny. Okay? It's used to do things for a policy of expansion at the expense of others. They're reaffirmed in the Civil War, which in a lot of ways the Civil War exposes the fragility of all these ideas. But between emancipation and the 13th Amendment, which got rid of the unenlightened practice of owning another human being as property, which was so offensive to natural law, even though Jefferson and those guys refused to deal with it. Think of Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, right? It's the height of the conflict. You've just won this big battle. You're dedicating the cemetery several months later. There's still coffins. Like when you look at the picture of the Gettysburg Address, there's like actual stacks of pine boxes from the horrifically smelling remains that are being dug up on the battlefield. They're not in the picture. I mean, that's how close this is to the event. And what does he say there? Some of you probably have memorized the Gettysburg Address. Hopefully you make your students memorize it. But I'm sure that's a fool's errand, right? So he says, our forefathers brought forth on this nation, on this continent, a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. It doesn't matter where he got those words. And that's all I didn't know. The Bible, Pericles' funeral oration, right? I mean, some people even think he got them out of John Marshall's McCulloch versus Maryland decision, that sort of thing. Doesn't matter. What matters is he used a critical moment when national survival hung in the balance to rely upon national values to reinforce why we were fighting. Okay? You find this stuff in the Monroe Doctrine. You want to talk about how this influences our national security policy or foreign policy? It's in the Monroe Doctrine. And I'm sure you know that by heart as well. There's a quote in one of the phrases is that the American continents, North, South America, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, in other words, they are now free from all this colonial crap, right? Should be left alone. Europe, stay out. These places are free, and they're kind of, sort of, roughly like us, so leave them alone. Now, at the time, we didn't have any way to enforce that or anything, but it's a principled statement to make. Fast forward to, again, Corey mentioned the 1901 State of the Union address from Teddy Roosevelt. This idea that we're going to use military force to spread these values. And, of course, with the Roosevelt corollary, we're going to use military force to protect them, too. Okay? So we're not going to let anybody inside those new republics in Central and South America screw this up. If it starts to go south, we're going to go in and fix it. All right? Now, this is a stretch, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Look at the open door policy. I think our values are reflected there. You want free and unfettered access to trade with China. You don't want any of the other great powers, right, controlling it. We should all of us powers should have access to exploiting China equally, right? Okay. But I think you can twist that around it's why do we care what happens to China other maybe than our own interest? I mean, that may be a more cynical way to look at it, but a more idealistic way to look at it would be we want to have the right to pursue our happiness in China. We also want to protect China's right to self-determination, that none of these powers should overwhelm it, determine what it's going to be. They should be the ones to decide that. I don't know. That's a little stretch. I'm not as confident as that one at all. But at least it's a principle, I think. World War I really brings all this stuff together, I think. When you look at Wilson's approach to mediation, his approach to defining American war aims, which he kind of assumed were going to be everyone else's war aims too, right? Not so much. And finally, how he worked at the Versailles Peace Conference using these principles to carry through with that. There's mixed success here, right? And of course, a lot of failure there. But I think what's important is the rest of the world sees what these values are. They are enunciated in such a way that a lot of peoples out there who especially are under the flag of somebody who isn't their own, in other words, you've got these non-white peoples who are in places that are part of these empires, they read this stuff, they read the 14 points, and they're like, I think I might want some of that their self-determination. That sounds pretty cool, right? I'd like to have some of that. But yeah, this is where, and this goes, Dr. McDougall's great book on Promised Land, Crusader State. I mean, it's just, the city on the hill idea is starting to go on the road a little bit here. We're starting to take it on the road. And people out there are like, maybe I'd like to embrace American values. Maybe I'd like to enjoy the fruits of self-government, individual liberty, and economic opportunity. Why not? Sounds pretty good. It's better than what we have right now. But all sounds great, but you remember World War I, it took really a lot for us to convince ourselves to finally go over there, right? To actually go over to France and do this. And of course, Great Britain and France aren't interested in this stuff at all. In fact, this kind of scares the hell out of them. They're like, Woody, that's really not what we want to fight this war for. We've got some pretty self-interested stuff here we'd like to achieve, and your little ideals are going to mess that up. Okay, 14 points, right? What Wilson is looking for is what he calls a just peace, peace without victory. He says these things several times over the months before we enter the war. What he's getting at, of course, can we not have a better peace? If we do a peace that we had before, that will be based on these old ideas of self-interest and stuff like that, it's not going to work. We got to have a better peace. And that means, not doing things with territorial aggrandizement, empire, that sort of thing, putting that aside, using these principles, right? That's the idea. A higher purpose. So, we're not going to go through all 14 points. I don't even know what they all are. I have to go to Wikipedia probably and look them up. But there's principles that matter, okay? Transparent diplomacy, no secret treaties that the governed don't know about and have no say in. Free navigation of the seas, so everybody can pursue economic opportunity. The idea there is, it's kind of like an open door policy for world trade. It's like, if you're prosperous, then you don't want to risk that prosperity in going to war. Because if you go to war, you might lose that prosperity. So the idea is prosperous nations won't go to war. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but that was the idea then. Self-determination and self-governance. And of course, this is what scared the hell out of the British and the French. And at the time, initially, the Germans. Later on, they didn't really care about that or not object to that as much. Because this threatens the idea of their empires. It rips the very fabric of how those nations are their values to a degree about having empires. Much more so than we were dedicated to ours, I guess. But for the people doing the fighting and dying, and the non-white peoples, again, who are part of these empires, this stuff sounds pretty good. Even a guy like Lenin is impressed with these 14 points. Gandhi is impressed with these 14 points as a young man. And a very young Ho Chi Minh is impressed with these 14 points. They resonate. American values are slowly becoming world values, maybe. Okay. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. Didn't really work out that well, right? The Treaty of Versailles, you know all about that, right? I mean, basically neuters Germany, and you're not going to keep that beast down very long. And sure enough, Germany did not stay down. Let's talk about Germany and Japan for a moment. Germany is a new state. Unified 1871 through the Franco-Prussian War. A new Germany challenges the Congress of Vienna balance of power system, that had been in place since the defeat of Napoleon. The roots of German nationalism, however, run a lot deeper. This is where you're getting into weird and wondrous things like German folklore, romanticism, and of course ethnicity, goes without saying almost. I mean, you don't find these liberal ideals of Locke and stuff like that. One, Locke wasn't a German. So there's that. And they didn't like his ideas anyway. But this is all about ethnic unity, cultural and military superiority, economic self-sufficiency, and acceptance of authoritarianism as the way of the state, as well as a sense of destiny, exceptionalism. Okay? They focus much less on the individual, more so on the group, the Volk. By the 1930s, the National Socialists have brought these things together in a great German national values reset to, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, make Germany great again. They didn't have red hats, but they had a little armband, so that's something, right? Yeah. They brilliantly manipulate these core German values to promote their program. And you see this in Triumph of the Will, right? You're all familiar with Triumph of the Will, the great propaganda film, Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 film about the 1934 National Socialist Party Congress at Nuremberg. I mean, there you've got like over 1 million Germans eagerly lapping up Adolf Hitler's promise to make Germany great again. But the film really is, and yet it's about the Congress, but its message was to the rest of Germany, hey, get on board. Be part of this. Don't be left out. Join the club. And it's these intoxicating ways that they try to bring the people of Germany in here. Militarism, power, Germany's rebirth as God's chosen nation, a civic religion that includes symbols like the swastika and stuff like that. Remember, they even used the blood banner from the 1920 beer hall revolt, right? They touched the flags to that flag, right? It's incredible symbolism, which drove everybody mad. It's choreographed mass marching, lots of Sieg Heiling and saluting, all this stuff. Very impressive. Why wouldn't you want to be part of all that, part of that group? There's no room for individuals in this, other than Hitler is the supreme individual. It's all about the group subjugating itself to the state. All right? And Germany's going to take its rightful place as the supreme power in Europe, if not the world. Never again will any nation belittle Germany. Remember the constant phrasing through that film, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, that sort of thing. And 1936 Olympics, right? I mean, all the symbolism, the showing off, look how great we are, stuff like that. You remember, I think this is right, when the Olympics is kind of a creepy thing anyway to me, but all these traditions and stuff, trying to copy the Greeks, etc. But when they started these things, they initially in the earlier Olympic Games, when the athletes walked in, they all walked in with the Olympic salute. Okay? So in 1936, everybody starts walking in, and Hitler's just beside himself with joy, a giddiness. I mean, just like, oh, this is awesome. I can't believe they're doing this. Because now I can say they're doing that for me. They really weren't. Now, after the 1936 Games, they stopped doing that. I mean, it's not a good idea. But they're the ones who started lighting the torch and all that stuff. There's so many traditions, actually, in the Olympic opening ceremony and whatnot that come from the 1936 German Games. Maybe you should rethink that. I don't know. Okay. But that's the idea. It's just getting to this rebirth of a nation through civic religion, all these symbols, stuff like that. Now, Japan's kind of similar. It's a relatively young state, even though it's been around for a while, and of course, a centuries-old culture. But it's young in the sense that it's the influence of Western ideas and stuff that, of course, Americans may have started this when Commodore Perry kicked down the door in 1854. But by the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, these Western influence they're really starting to pour in. And it's really centered around ideas like industrialization and the subsequent military power you get from that. Remember Tom Cruise went there and helped them build a new army, right? And then he realized that, oh crap, what have I done? And then he goes native. Yeah. The shogunate collapses, the Meiji take over. You have a godlike emperor. Again, it's about the group, less the individual. Yeah, they have a parliament and a cabinet and a prime minister and stuff like that. But in a lot of ways, I think that's more to... since you got rid of the shogunate, you got to have some way to give important people individuals or give important people status within the system. And that allows you to do that, I think. So it serves a purpose, I guess. But nationalism and civic religion are clearly evident here. And again, national security for Japan is tied to a belief of its racial superiority, its economic expansion, which includes territorial expansion. And, they did this. I mean, they had some wars against China in the 1890s. Of course, we've mentioned the 1904-05 Russian-Japanese War that they win. They've announced their presence with authority, okay? Pretty much. Later on, they'll give this whole thing a name, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. I wonder if they have a hat that has that on it, right? Again, why wouldn't you want to be part of that? But neither one of these countries values individual liberties. They don't value individual freedoms. They don't value enlightened self-governance, free trade, collective security. They're not interested in those things. It's all about themselves. These ultra-nationalist values that are kind of counter to our own that put them down this path of exceptionalism that ironically is a similar path that we're on, okay, at this time. All right. America, or as we should say, America, right? America. We're scared. Talk about Thucydides' fear. Our fear is, in the 1930s, that we are an endangered species, that capitalism and civil society is collapsing, is going by the wayside, may even become extinct. Because we're not the ones who are recovering as quickly through this great economic crisis. These other places have become great again. We are still struggling, right? We're still having a problem. And so as you get closer to 1941, how do you convince people here in the United States who are still very understandably isolationist, but also concerned about what's happening in the world and what that means for American values, or American interests primarily. But how do you convince them that our values are under threat by a Germany and a Japan? Well, you got to tell them about our values. You have to remind them. This is what Roosevelt does in his State of the Union, 1941. This is Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy. He builds upon the 14 points from Wilson, who he's very much influenced by, to a program, he calls it the Four Freedoms, right? What he's doing is he's taking the opportunity to sell American values, to sell democracy and liberal values in the face of National Socialism, in the face of Japanese militarism. Remember, he says in that speech, if men do not live by bread alone, they do not fight by armaments alone. There has to be something more to it. Values have to matter. Otherwise, the sacrifice you're going to make in a conflict that we're not in yet won't be worth it. So he offers this higher calling. These freedoms aren't original, right? They come from a lot of things we've already talked about. Hell, even in the 1939 World's Fair in New York, they used a version of Four Freedoms. This is before he gives this speech. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to assemble, and freedom of religion. You can Google this. There's just Leo Friedlander's statues there at the World's Fair complex of these four freedoms. They're kind of humanized, and they're really creepy looking. They look like they should be in Nazi Germany, actually, the way that that kind of 30s Art Deco-ish style. But you check those out. You can Google image those. But Roosevelt's four freedoms are basically this. First is the freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want. What does he mean by that? Basically, that, and this is his words, it means economic understandings which secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, i.e. prosperity. The fourth is freedom from fear, which means we should live in a world that we don't have to worry about getting slaughtered in by somebody else. Disarm somehow, to at least to the point where you just have a defensive capability. A world that shares these values would be for him, and this is his words, the very antithesis to the so-called new order of tyranny which dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb. This sounds great, pretty cool. But a lot of Americans remain unconvinced. There was still a division on whether to remain, and again, to use Dr. McDougall's words, the promised land versus the crusader state, like so many Wilsonians especially desired. But they were great propaganda. We had a Four Freedoms flag. We had pamphlets that we printed, dropped, smuggled all over the world. This is before we even got in the war. There's a monument at Madison Square Garden to the Four Freedoms, Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. I don't know why it's at Madison Square Garden. Norman Rockwell, right? You're familiar with his paintings, okay? Those, right? They're published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1943, I believe. To give a visual effect of the Four Freedoms, exactly. It doesn't really, it does matter, but regardless of the reception here at home, the ideas, these were the values that we had. These are what resonated. These are what survived the war. I mean, look at the Young United Nations in 1945. Their Declaration of Human Rights, they include the Four Freedoms, okay? So American values are slowly becoming universal values. Now, he'll do this again a few months later when he meets Winston Churchill in what will become known as when they create the Atlantic Charter. You know how that goes down, right? Roosevelt says he's going on a fishing trip. That's why he's not around. And he and Churchill meet secretly off the coast of Newfoundland. And Churchill is so damn desperate, he'll sign anything. He'll agree to anything to get us in the war. And Roosevelt takes full advantage. He hits him with a set of war aims that are very Wilsonian, and Churchill has no choice but to say yes. All right? Territorial expansion or gain is rejected. Self-determination, so much for your little British Empire. Access to trade, lower trade barriers, right? Economic prosperity. Social welfare, there's a different one. Very progressive idea from the progressive movement. Freedom from want and fear, freedom of the seas. Again, take that, Winston, right? Freedom of the seas. And, of course, disarmament. Those become our war aims. Those will be the war aims that we will use for the other allies. Stalin will even sign on to this. Not that Stalin wouldn't sign anything, but, right? He signs. Okay? Gandhi. Hey, those are pretty cool. I like them. Ho Chi Minh. Hey, those are pretty cool. I like those, right? Of course, they're both. Ho Chi Minh will be sorely disappointed. So, Churchill's got little choice here. He's got to accept these things. Still, we remained as a people not convinced that this was worth going out there and fighting and dying for. It still took Japan attacking Pearl Harbor to break this hard-headed reluctance to get involved. Okay? So my talk could have just been 2 minutes long. But the values, I think, still are important. They play a role. They shape our ideas, shape what we're fighting for. Therefore, why we fight, right? Okay. Now, most of you are wondering, well, wait a minute. What about this? What about that? What about these people? What about, okay, here's my part to kind of cover myself. Just because a nation has values doesn't mean that it adheres to them. It doesn't mean that it applies them evenly. It doesn't mean it extends all this largesse to all of its citizens or anybody else. It can be very selective, and we have certainly done that. Explain these values to African Americans, to the Cherokee, to the Choctaw, to the Seminole, right, with Indian removal, any Native Americans. Explain these values to women. Explain these values to immigrants, nativism, things like that. Explain them to the Hawaiians. Explain them to victims of lynching, disenfranchisement, constitutionally dubious alien sedition acts, religious intolerance, all those things. Explain them to Japanese Americans interned during the war. Explain them to Hispanic Americans in Los Angeles, the Zoot Suit riots. Explain them to Jackie Robinson in 1944. National values sometimes don't do so well, right? But so undeniable and desirable are these values that these left out peoples in the United States and abroad aspired to them. Much of American history, I think, and much of the history of the modern world, and especially the 20th century, is a story of this aspiration, and World War II is central to that story. American values shaped why we fought the war, how we fought it, which I'm not getting into, and how we tried to win a better peace. Okay, I'm going to shut up. One last thing. The 2015 National Security Strategy of the United States says, we will advance respect of universal values at home and around the world by holding ourselves to the highest possible standard by living our values at home, even as we do what is necessary to keep our people safe and our allies secure. Can we have it both ways? I'm done. Thank you. Okay, I'm exposed. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Jim Feldman, Lakeshore Schools. I looked up the statues that you had mentioned. The figure for freedom of speech is male, while the other three are female. Do you want to comment on that? I'm just kidding. No.
No, I will actually. Well, no, I'm happy to comment on that. No, I mean, look, that time period and going back probably about almost 100 years from the 1940s backward, the traditional figure of liberty, that idea is Columbia, which is a female figure. So when Corey was mentioning this morning the cover for Puck Magazine, which I saw several of you looking that up because I could see over your shoulders back there. I know what you're doing. And that's a Gibson girl, but it's also a play on the figure of liberty, right? There's also that great thing from David, you've probably seen it, for the Great White Fleet, there's that cartoon of like the figure of Columbia straddling one of the battleships, sitting on this huge throne. It's like she's on steroids, right? Armed to the teeth, but of course with the wheat stalk of prosperity, right? That sort of thing. There's the Cuban Pacification Medal, where the figure is Columbia, female form. It's unbelievably paternalistic and racist. There's this great figure, right? This Amazon woman who, in robes, sword in one hand, wheat stalk of prosperity laying down like this, and on the ground, on his knees, is the Cuban peon, grateful, thankful that America has come to save his ass. Right? I'm sorry. I know this is filmed, and my mother's probably going to watch it. So my wife said, don't swear so much. But anyway, back, please. You had a real question.
Actually, I did. The United States during World War II, in many ways, went to many elements of a command economy.
Yes.
Which is very un-American, if you will. Is this where America has to kind of be a little bit like its enemy to beat its enemy?
Okay, no, but that's good. That attests to these ideas that in war, sometimes you have to put principles on the shelf. And in that case, in order for a democracy, a capitalist free society, to fight that war on that scale, we believed we had to, in essence, become a socialist-controlled economy. The War Department took over the economy, and that was part of the plan, because we screwed that up in World War I. I mean, we really messed that up bad. Our mobilization plans, military and industrially, and for industry, were not that great and didn't really get off the ground. And in the interwar period, which we didn't call the interwar period because we didn't know there was going to be another war, it's like you got to tell your students, no, it wasn't called World War I at the time because, right? And usually they understand that, usually. So guys like Eisenhower and Marshall spent time not only working on military mobilization plans, but also industrial mobilization. And that included the War Department basically taking over all aspects of the economy, everything from price controls, right, to production, right? You remember the great, I guess probably the best indicator of this is there are what, like, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of new cars built in 1941. In 1943, there's only like 6, because all the automobile plants are building tanks and B-24s and deuce-and-a-half trucks and who knows what else. So price controls, right, which is not a capitalist thing. I mean, there's all sorts of things. And look, the Civil War, I mean, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. I mean, you don't think he'd be impeached for something, that if there was enough people in the other, that they might have tried to impeach him for that? Can you imagine a president today? Well, let's don't go that route. But you know what I mean? I mean, that's so, and let's go back to Thucydides, which is always good to do. What did Athens do? Athens gave up a lot of its principles, a lot of its values in order to prosecute that war. What happened to Athens? It was destroyed. Marshall in World War II, if I remember this right, is very concerned by 1944 that if this war lasts another 4 or 5 years and we have to keep doing what we're doing, in other words, the way we're doing it, taking control of the economy and all that, that we will not be able to go back. That democracy writ large is going to have a hard time recovering. Democracies aren't cut out for fighting long, drawn-out wars. And so this thing can't last that long. We need to win this thing in 1945, 46, 47 at the absolute latest. If it drags into 48, 49, we're going to be in trouble. That was his idea, or his concern there. But yeah, when you say it makes it like the others, I mean, look, Roosevelt's New Deal and the National Socialist program in Germany of getting them out of the Depression, they're pretty much doing the same thing. One's using deficit spending, the other one is a little leery of deficit spending, but what Roosevelt doing, what Hitler's doing with public works projects and stuff like that, they're kind of doing the same thing there for the same purpose. Use government money to put people to work to get the economy going again. And, you can argue, at least Time Magazine, 1936, Hitler's our man of the year. He did it better. So, yeah, I don't know if that's just my take. Yes?
I was just wondering if you thought Lincoln's words are sort of accessible for all Americans, since he was just arguing for the purpose of war for one side of the war, looking back on it.
So you mean should it apply to the side that had committed treason?
Yeah. And are the dead that he's talking about just Union dead? What do you think?
I think he's talking about all dead. I mean, I know I'm being facetious, but I think he's talking about all dead. He sees it as, I think he sees it as a that that the Union dead are dying for this higher calling, that the Southern dead, while they're dying for probably one of the worst causes in history, they're still dying. And you know, I mean, Lincoln's a kind of religious guy. He's very biblical, right? A lot of his speeches are very biblical influence, right? That sort of thing. And I think he is, while others, Seward and those guys may have been, you know, the hell with the kill as many as we need to get this thing done or whatever. Lincoln, I think, is like, I don't like this. I don't like the killing. I don't, you know, he realized it had to be done, but he didn't like I don't think he liked the extent of it. That's the best I can give you on that, I think. But go.
You know, just wondering, just because we tend to think of it, looking back, think of it as sort of this universal speech, but I don't know if it's because he assumed he was going to put the country back together, or that basically it
no,
was.
Look, no, okay, I
was,
see what you're saying. No, yeah. He's looking forward. Absolutely. No, he is definitely looking forward. You know, guys, one of the hardest things of war is not, maybe less so the war itself. A lot of times it's what happens afterwards. What's the then what? What do we do next? You know, once we win this thing, now what do we got to do? Right? And, you know, American history and history writ large is filled with examples of we don't do this very well. I mean, Reconstruction, right? You know, the American Revolutionary War. I mean, we kind of yucked that up for a few years till we had to tear down the whole government and build it up again, right? Create something new. World War I, Versailles. Oh, boy, let's do that again. That worked out well. You know, Korea. It's kind of like, I don't even know what to do with that. Vietnam. Boy, that was good. And of course, you know, 2003 in Iraq, right? I mean, we just don't do, it's hard. It's not that we're not, it's just hard to do. The then what is just very difficult. And I think we just assume that we win and then we have a better peace and it's fine. But it takes a lot of effort and stuff. And I think Lincoln is looking forward to reconciliation, bringing the nation back together, right? I mean, not to go too on with it, but when we talk about the American Revolutionary War, one of the biggest problems the British had, and not many of them realized, but guys like General Howe and people like that realized, was, okay, you put down this rebellion, then what? How do we bring these colonies back into our system as full participants and be better than we were before? So we got to be careful about how we do this. It's easy to tell me, go destroy Washington's army because that's the center of gravity. Fine, I can do that. But if I annihilate Washington's army and I string up Washington and these other people, how are we going to repair the relationship? Because we're all British, right? How are we going to repair the relationship? And of course, I think that's what the colonists had recognized, the ones who supported independence. They recognized that, well, you know, it's never going to be the same again. It's like, you know, me in fifth grade, I walked into the lunchroom and she was holding hands with someone else. And I'm still in therapy. But it's the relationship's never going to be the same again, right? How do we... Tom, can you write me a declaration to just end this? All right, thanks. Because we're through. But yeah, I think it's a good. But I think that's what he's doing there, is trying to look forward. Absolutely. Oh, there. Sorry. Yes.
I've got Chris Hughes of Stanwich School. Can you talk about how isolationist America was just prior to Pearl Harbor?
Sure.
And absent Pearl Harbor, it's like counterfactual. Do you think we go to war in Europe? Yeah,
it's hard. I mean, there's a few things feeding this. I mean, obviously, the experience of the World War in 1917, 1918 is feeding it. The economic crisis is feeding it. There was a strong sense that the reason this happened to us was because of the other stuff happening in the world. And if we were separate from that, didn't have to deal with that our economy wouldn't suffer so much. So by all means, let's put in higher protective tariffs so we can stymie world trade even more, right? It's counterintuitive, but that's kind of was the thought process. So there's that aspect of it. And then, there's just, God, are we going to have to go do this again? Germany hasn't really attacked us. Convince me that if Germany takes over Europe, that's bad for us. Won't we just establish trade relationships with them and keep going on and making, maybe that'll get our economy going back again, because Hitler will now have a Napoleonic-style continental system for all of Europe, and that should be better for us, theoretically. I mean, the people are saying stuff like this, all right? And in Japan, I think Roosevelt saw Germany as a real existential threat. That if Germany does conquer all of Europe and then gets Great Britain too, then we're in trouble. That we're going to be in his sights. He may not militarily take us over. We may not have the man in the high castle, but we're economically going to be a vassal state of this new Third Reich thing. And he's really concerned about that. Japan, I think, is seen less as an existential threat, more of that's just a regional kind of pain in the ass. Why are you doing? Stop doing what you're doing. You're messing things up. I mean, things were okay over there. Why are you doing? Now, there's other people who are more concerned about Japan, but I think Roosevelt's less concerned about it. And so to me, it's very ironic that it's actually the Japanese attack that gets us into the war, when what I think Roosevelt wanted was the war against Germany first, and then if we have to do something with Japan later on, then we'll try to take care of that. But I mean, as you know, by 1941, we're already in an undeclared U-boat war, right, with Germany. That's going on. Stuff's getting sunk off Daytona Beach, that sort of thing. We're already kind of in a shooting war, but we're not promoting that. We're not selling that. For some reason, Roosevelt's reluctant to capitalize upon that stuff to try to get us into the war. And so it's interesting to me that the way he tries to lay the foundation, the groundwork, is through values. Hey, this is who we are, this is who they are, and who they are is counter to what we are. And if they win, we're not going to be able to live like we've been living. That was the idea. And he thought that would resonate with people more. And for some reason, it doesn't initially. It takes that attack. But then once that attack happens and you start throwing in all the propaganda with the, focusing on the values and stuff, everyone laps it up and okay, yeah, fine. And we didn't go forward with this. And I don't know if Hal or Heather's going to get into this tomorrow or not, but this kind of sets up look at NSC 68. It outlines core American values, and this is why these are our values, and these are their values, and their values are bad, and here's why. They are a threat to us, and here's why. It's almost like, because what we did with values in World War II, I think made it easier for us to do what we did with values in the Cold War and make them more meaningful and better use as a way to shape why we were doing what we're doing philosophically, fundamentally. Now, clearly these things get us in trouble. We misuse them and stuff like that. I mean, that's something else we could get into. But does that help any? Yeah, I'm being told I need to stop.
Thank you very much.